In 2017, Team Cherry released their indie Metroidvania, Hollow Knight. Following a successful Kickstarter, the game was released to a generally positive reception, praised for its engaging gameplay, a compelling cast who would often meet tragic ends, and the chilling narrative laid out in pieces through the ruins of the game's setting, the Kingdom of Hallownest. The kingdom was destroyed by a plague, and the player takes on the role of a strange little knight as it searches the depths of the kingdom for the truth of this infection and its own existence. In the years following Hollow Knight's release, its popularity grew as Team Cherry continued to improve upon it with a series of free downloadable content updates. Buzz around the game's planned follow-up, Hollow Knight Silksong, intensified as well, and something of a feedback loop developed. People would pick up Hollow Knight because they wanted to know why everyone was so rabid about Silksong. Originally planned as DLC itself, Silksong was expanded into its own game, revealed as such in 2019 and released in September of 2025. Featuring the demigod spider Hornet, one of the most popular characters from Hollow Knight, as its protagonist, Silksong promised a kingdom that yet lived for her to explore, and a chance to restore that kingdom's hope. Team Cherry offered relatively little information while the game was in development, sparking a great deal of curiosity, along with a more than healthy share of frustration. Prior to the game's release, we really knew very little about what the game would offer. However, there was one character who received something approaching the spotlight, as she featured as a boss in the demo at E3 2019 and was even included on merchandise at the event. Her role was compared in promotional materials to Hornet's in the first game. This character was Lace. She caught the attention of many hopeful players right away, with her gleefully vicious personality on full display in approximately 3 lines of dialogue. Assured in a blog post that Lace would delight in causing Hornet's swift, skewered demise, Lace had a lot of people asking, what the hell is her deal? As it happens, her deal is at the heart of Hollow Knight Silksong. Silksong's story indeed focuses on Hornet and answers questions of her nature and her past, as promised. Brought to Farloom by force, Hornet explores the kingdom to learn who or what it is that wanted her there alive so badly. The kingdom is controlled by a mysterious citadel, and the bugs of the kingdom are charged to make pilgrimages to reach the citadel's holy halls. Unfortunately, on top of the journey's usual dangers, Farloom is haunted. A strange curse causes pilgrims to turn violent and attack their fellows. The cause of this affliction is unknown, but Hornet can see part of it. Spider silk, wielded on a massive scale to manipulate the haunting's victims. She learns that the kingdom is ruled by a higher being who claims godhood, much like her divine father once did. Farloom's god elevated the Weavers, Hornet's family on her mortal side, from their origins as simple spiders to sapient beings, called them her daughters, and commanded their worship. However, this monarch appears to have been a difficult parent, and the Weavers eventually discovered that she lied about the details of their creation. They rejected any relationship to her, and sealed her away in slumber, taking power in Farloom for themselves. They established a kingdom built around eternal song, an everlasting lullaby to keep this god bound in sleep. The plan failed in the end. Their would-be mother stirred, and began to grasp the threads of her power still woven into Farloom. This was the cause of the haunting, and as she regained control of the kingdom by manipulating its citizens, the monarch sent out parties to retrieve the Weavers who had dared to flee, or their descendants. Though Hornet resisted fiercely, she was ultimately subdued by one such party and brought to Farloom. There, she must fight for the fate of the kingdom and her own survival. Lace pursues Hornet through her journey, confronting her at key moments in the story. Though she doesn't make an appearance until later on, it's likely that we see Lace's actions first in the game's intro cutscene. It will become clearer soon, but the game implies in a few places that Lace is the one who sent the Silkfly to break the seal on Hornet's cage. We'll discuss her possible motivation for doing so later on. Hornet can actually encounter Lace for the first time in a few places in Silksong's Act 1. Many players will likely take Hornet through the deep docks, where Lace serves as a boss, blocking the way to the next area. Hornet finds Lace humming to herself as she conducts a small gathering of silk flies with her weapon. So, right away, we see that she appears capable of controlling creatures like the one that freed Hornet. This is the clearest implication that Lace was responsible, but that doesn't make her an ally to the fugitive spider. Lace taunts Hornet, promising to spare her from further suffering by killing her. Hornet, naturally, declines this generous offer, in favor of telling Lace to shut up and fight her, but in a courtly way befitting a demigod princess. Lace's exact words before she engages our protagonist in combat are, "Delicious. I like you already." When Hornet defeats her, Lace flees and demonstrates some impressive leg strength by jumping clear of the arena in a single bound. Hornet is then free to continue her ascent. There are a few ways to avoid this fight, with alternative paths available to reach the Citadel, but it isn't possible to avoid Lace. Depending on the player's chosen path upward, Hornet can encounter her for the first time in either the Blasted Steps or Sinner's Road. Both of these locations feature the same dialogue, similar to what precedes the Deep Docks boss fight, but Lace follows up her delicious comment by observing that Hornet has come so achingly close to the Citadel, and it would be boring to kill her before she can reach it. Lace departs without a fight in both of these instances. Notable about the Blasted Steps encounter is that Lace is waiting for Hornet perched on the other side of the bridge Hornet broke when she escaped at the start of the game. The implication is less direct than Lace conducting the silk flies, but it's an interesting place for her to wait, and connects her to the opening cutscene once again. These three encounters, the Deep Docks fight, the Blasted Steps, and Sinner's Road, are mutually exclusive. The player will only experience one in a given playthrough, but Hornet and Lace always confront each other at least once before Hornet reaches the Citadel. Though the player is given many options to shape Hornet's journey, encountering Lace is inevitable. Hornet will meet Lace next in the Coral Chambers, shortly after reaching the Citadel at the start of Act 2. The location and exact dialogue have two variants depending on where Hornet encountered Lace during Act 1 and how she finally made it to the Citadel, but the essence of the conversation is the same in both cases. Hornet claims to be unimpressed by the challenge the Citadel poses, and Lace questions her optimism, warning Hornet that she cannot conceive of what waits for her at Farloom's Peak. Hornet corrects this assumption. She's seen enough to know that a god is responsible for the kingdom's condition and her capture, and she is not intimidated. Lace rejoins that she's been watching Hornet, and her performance so far lacks the grace necessary to face a fathomless being like the god of Farloom. Hornet counters, telling Lace to keep watching, and shares that, in her experience, even gods can fall. Lace has no response to Hornet's obstinance, and departs in frustration, again allowing Hornet to climb higher. After this, the two will not meet again until the end of Act 2, when Hornet stands before the peak of the kingdom, in an area known as the Cradle. Lace once again challenges Hornet before she can make her final ascent. After she's defeated a second time, Lace takes on a more solemn bearing and speaks in a lower, sadder tone that contrasts her previous playful manner. She reveals her true nature to Hornet. Lace is a construct of silk, crafted by the higher being that haunts Farloom. She was created to play the role of the monarch's child, but considers herself a husk who can only act as such. However, it seems Hornet already had some idea of this, and when Hornet tells Lace that her existence counts as a life regardless of how she came to be, Lace accuses Hornet of offering her platitudes, and also outright says that the idea is gross. In spite of her haughty demeanor, complete with classic noblewoman laugh, it appears that Lace doesn't perceive herself as a real bug, a real person in this context. She instructs Hornet to complete her ascent and face the Holy Mother who fashioned such a cruel and crude daughter. It's Hornet her mother wants, after all. Having delivered this message with its air of finality, Lace collapses. Now, I'd like to circle back for a minute to the Deep Docks fight, along with another facet of the Cradle fight, needolin dialogue. Hornet can string her needle and use it as an instrument, the needolin. Its music has magical properties, the most common of which is to compel those who hear it to sing. This provides additional dialogue and further insight into characters under the needolin's power, similar to the function of the dream nail in Hollow Knight. Normally, the player won't have unlocked the needolin for Lace's encounter in the Deep Docks, but if the player has used mods to make the needolin available, Lace's first fight does have this dialogue. It may be something that was meant to be cut, but given the significance of it, and the fact that the game has been patched a few times now, it feels more like an Easter egg. It's well known by now that players will tear open a game to get at its guts and see if there's anything interesting in there. This bonus needolin dialogue is in line with Lace's initial image, as she seems to revel in chaos and pain. However, unlike most characters, Lace does not sing when the needolin is played. She stands stiffly at attention, quivering and laughing in uncanny bursts. By the time Hornet faces Lace in the cradle, the needolin will have been unlocked normally. When the needolin is used here, Lace stands with the same tension as in the Deep Docks, but she makes no sound. She's no longer even laughing. Frankly, I would say Lace seems like she might be trying to resist in both cases, and is possibly in pain as a result, but regardless, she's clearly desperate in the cradle. She doesn't have a good grasp of what she lacks to cause her mother to prefer Hornet, or she's denying the reason to herself. Either way, she wants badly for her mother to see her strength and the effort she puts forth on her mother's behalf. After Lace's second defeat, a silk heart appears, which had seemingly been in her possession. Hornet can collect up to 3 silk hearts throughout the game. One is missable, so this will be either the second or third, and, like the others, Hornet experiences a vision of a strange, web-bound dreamscape after she collects it. As she climbs to fully claim the silk heart and its power, dialogue plays over the scene. This dialogue references Lace, and it is clear by this point of the game that the speaker is Farloom's divine monarch. Though she created Lace, the monarch seems to have found her wanting, but she still preferred to have any child at all rather than none, after having been betrayed and abandoned by the Weavers. At this point, the player can indeed complete Hornet's ascent and challenge the final boss of Act 2, the monarch herself, Grandmother Silk. If Hornet does so, the player sees the Weaver Queen ending, and Lace doesn't appear again. However, there can be more to the story. If Hornet returns to the Citadel after defeating Lace, she can plot with the caretaker of Songclave. The caretaker is actually a snail shaman, one of a group with access to powerful magic. The shaman and his family, 2 other similarly disguised characters Hornet has encountered previously, work with Hornet to prepare a trap for Grandmother Silk. Along with possessing the knowledge Hornet needs to fight the monarch without losing herself, the caretaker also appears to be familiar with Lace. He has some choice words about her after Hornet defeats Lace in the cradle, referring to her as a flawed marvel and claiming that she has the look of a child and a mind to match, even though she has roamed the Citadel longer than most. He speculates that Lace may have seen herself as protecting the Citadel throughout this time, which she did by slaughtering pilgrims she came across. The accuracy of the caretaker's comments is subject to debate, and will be a subject in this video, as he's one of the only characters in the game to talk about Lace, and the only one with anything significant to say about her. Hornet, of course, continues to be a busy little spider. She gathers the necessary materials for the plan to overthrow Farloom's god. The caretaker lays the trap, and Hornet issues her challenge. Hornet wins and springs the trap. However, it calls upon the power of the void, a dangerous, devouring substance, or lack of substance, that lies in an abyss below the kingdom. The void snares Grandmother Silk, and begins to pull her into the abyss with Hornet in her grasp. Before she can drag Hornet to their mutual demise, Lace intervenes. She jumps into the arena and severs her mother's arm, freeing Hornet and then bearing down relentlessly with her blade buried in her mother's chest. As a result of Lace's actions, the Void drags her to the abyss in Hornet's stead, along with Grandmother Silk. Hornet falls from the cradle, and tremors begin to shake the kingdom. Act 3 is ready to begin. The situation in Farloom, already grim, has grown dire. It appears that the monarch cared for her daughter after all, enough to resist the Void to protect Lace. Now, Grandmother Silk's struggles threaten to break the kingdom at its foundations, and the Void itself has entered the kingdom on the monarch's threads. It possesses creatures haunted and free alike, and makes enemies significantly more dangerous when it does. Determined to forestall this doom, Hornet changes course, descending into the abyss. There, Hornet questions whether the monarch is willing to sacrifice the kingdom to protect Lace. Grandmother Silk doesn't answer, but Lace does, or at least a phantasm of her. Hornet calls Lace's striking back at her mother a small rebellion, and Lace replies that she rebelled by letting Hornet live, and her true victory was in denying her mother Hornet's silken strength. Lace calls herself pathetic and broken, and delights in the prospect that her grandmother knows that Lace killed her and ended her kingdom. Rejoice, she says, and let it all come down. Hornet, as ever, refuses. She will not play the role of a sentinel for a dying land ever again. Guarding Hallownest's corpse was enough for her. Lace, as ever, mocks her hope, but Hornet has an idea and declares that she will cut this land finally free of Lace's mother's grasp. Hornet returns to Farloom proper to speak with the snail shamans and devise a plan to save Farloom. After claiming the kingdom's ancient powers for herself, Hornet enters her own memories with the help of the shamans and plucks forth from her recollections a single flower, the Everbloom, which can repel the Void. Hornet's family has its own history with the Void, which is largely the subject of the original Hollow Knight. Her father, the Pale King of Hallownest, experimented with the Void and tried to use it to trap a rival god, the Radiance. He had first imprisoned the Radiance within the realm of dreams. From there, however, she caused the infection by invading the dreams of Hallownest citizens, not unlike how Grandmother Silk haunted Farloom. To stop the infection, the Pale King sought to create a hollow being, a creature that could dream but would have no will for the Radiance to manipulate, thus preventing her from escaping that one dream. This plan involved the mass infanticide of his own children, drowned in the Void, from among whom a single child was selected as the Hollow Knight. The plan failed, just as the Weaver's Seal had, and among its other consequences, this failure condemned Hornet to the lonely existence we see in Hollow Knight, guarding the ruins of her home. Emerging from her memories with the ever-blooming claw, Hornet returns to the abyss and tells Lace that she is ready to face her and save the kingdom from the consequences of both of their actions. Lace asks what Hornet hopes to find, as only an ailing child and a silk-starved beast remain in the Void. Hornet answers that she seeks to free Farloom, and promises that she would slay even Lace's shadow in order to do so. Lace wants to know why Hornet is hesitating at this final moment, but Hornet claims the last word between them, and declares that she won't give up her own life, and that as a daughter of Hallownest, she no longer fears the Void. She dives with the Everbloom's protection, and enters the cocoon woven by Grandmother Silk to shield herself and her daughter. The silk is already soaked through, and in these depths, she encounters the game's true final boss, Lost Lace. Lace has been drenched in the Void, and obtained some frightening new abilities from it. She has nothing more to say to Hornet. She just releases an ear-splitting wail in horrible harmony with her mother and attacks. After a great deal of effort, and the mastering of some nasty new attack patterns on the player's part, Hornet defeats Lace for a third time. Lace sinks down into the Void, flooding the cocoon, but soon reemerges, no longer sodden in black. Hornet collects her and receives the last of the monarch's silk, given freely to allow Hornet and Lace to escape. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like it will be enough. The Everbloom is spent before they can reach the surface, and as its light winks out, the void closes in around them. And then, in a moment that made a lot of players lose our cheese, the Knight and their myriad siblings, Hornet's siblings as well, arrive from the depths to save her. She regains consciousness on the platform she dove from, takes stock of her surroundings, and Lace is there. Lace stirs and looks back at Hornet, laughing. The camera returns to Hornet, lingering on her unreadable face before fading to the credits. Lace is a critical figure in Silksong's narrative. Indeed, she may be second only to Hornet herself, and Lace's importance in Silksong likely surpasses Hornet's own in Hollow Knight. After all, Hollow Knight's most hard-won ending did not center on the loss and rescue of Hornet. Narratively and thematically, Lace is at the heart of Hollow Knight Silksong. However, Lace, like most characters aside from Hornet herself, gets a relatively small amount of actual screen time. On one hand, this leaves a lot of room for interpretation regarding her interiority, always fun to play with. On the other, it means we don't have a ton to extrapolate from when we're thinking about her. Certainly, there's enough worth digging into directly from Lace herself, but there is also a secondary source of sorts that I'd like to analyze first. As mentioned earlier, the caretaker of Songclave has something to say about Lace, and it is not kind. The caretaker is a snail shaman. We saw a few of these individuals in Hollow Knight, but focusing on their presence in Silksong, the snail shamans drew power from, and likely worshipped, the void. However, their sect was stamped out under the rule of the Citadel, who were no more tolerant of other forms of worship than the real Catholic Church. It's easy to think of several reasons why the caretaker is ill-disposed toward Lace, many of them entirely reasonable. An individual who adopted the title of caretaker, disliking a being who apparently spent quite a length of time killing pilgrims? Yeah, I wonder why they wouldn't get along. However, I would argue that as a result of this disdain, the caretaker's opinion of Lace should be taken with a grain of salt at the very least. So let's actually take a look at that conversation between Hornet and the caretaker now. Hornet is impressed at the complexity of Lace's existence. Hornet notes that she's seen life woven from silk before, but tiny and transient. In Hollow Knight, the knight can find the Weaver's Song charm, which allows it to summon small spiders made of silk to aid in combat, known as Weaverlings. Hornet was the charm's intended recipient. Though she never received it, she would be familiar with the concept of Silk-Spun life, and she's likely referring to something on the scale of the Weaverlings when she says this. Lace, by contrast, is clearly an entire person, in spite of herself. The caretaker concedes that Lace's existence is a marvel, but a flawed one. However, does she have the look of a child, much less the mind of one? In the same sentence, he also states that she's been wandering the Citadel longer than most, even while the haunting was dormant in its halls. Given her unique construction, this doesn't necessarily mean that she isn't a child, but she's certainly been alive longer than most adult bugs in the setting. She could very well be an adult, or the silken construct equivalent of one. Lace remains something of an enigma to the end. The truth of her nature only raises more questions. As a result of this, what the caretaker has to say is inevitably going to color our perception of her, and that's why it's important to interrogate that information. The caretaker also refers to Lace as a protector. This is an important term, closely connected to Hornet since the first game. She's been identified as the protector of Hallownest, as both its protector princess and princess knight. Her first boss fight in Hollow Knight is labeled as Hornet Protector, while her second fight is Hornet Sentinel. Lace is not the only character in Silksong to parallel Hornet in the role of a protector, but what makes that parallel true for Lace, if we have to doubt the validity of what the caretaker says about her? The simplest answer is needolin dialogue. In the Cradle fight, Lace's needolin dialogue includes, "See me, your knight." This is addressed at her mother. The status of knights as protectors is well established in these games. Effective protectors, perhaps not, but they're trying. And Lace's needolin dialogue does suggest that she sees herself in this light. Additionally, the caretaker qualifies his statement that Lace might have seen herself as the Citadel's protector. So his speculation may be less loaded than what, in context, amounts to an insult calling Lace immature. And, as we'll see, Lace isn't the only character in Silksong who might have a deceptively youthful appearance. Lace shares several noteworthy parallels with Hornet. Beginning with the aspects that are visible to the audience, their height is probably the clearest unifying factor. The characters in Silksong's world vary widely in size and shape. If we look at the chart, you can get some idea of the variation overall, and see how Hornet and Lace are both approximately the same height and stand at close to eye level with each other. Their perspectives literally line up with each other. Even their heads are close in size, with Lace's head or headpiece oriented horizontally and with downward points, while Hornet's mask is vertical with more dramatic upward points. Hornet, in general, does have a sharper design than Lace. Hornet's long horns are her most distinctive feature. And though the folds of her cloak are rounded, the way it drapes gives her a triangular silhouette. Lace, meanwhile, is more rounded with her crescent head, poofy shorts, and padded shoulders, though the shoulder pads are themselves rather pointed, giving her a bit of sharpness to her design, just as the folds of Hornet's cloak lend her some softer lines. It feels almost as though their designs exist in conversation with each other. Now, let's try to think about what the bugs see. It's left up to audience interpretation whether or not Lace is literally a child, or if she has grown beyond any childhood she might have had by the time we meet her. Certainly, she doesn't look particularly childish to most viewers, but frankly, the non-human characters in these games have delightfully non-human appearances, and it can be difficult as an audience to assess factors like age by sight alone. Bugs, varying as they do, also seem to have some trouble among themselves. It's stated that Lace has the look of a child, and indeed, Hornet refers to Lace as a child during their encounters. But Hornet herself is called a child as well. One major NPC, Chakra, calls Hornet a child throughout much of the game. It's generally agreed upon that Hornet is an adult, however, in part because she says so. Hornet tells Chakra that her childhood has long since passed. But let's be real, that's exactly the kind of thing a teenager might say to being called a child. There's also an unnamed pilgrim who observes that Hornet looks as fresh as when she was hatched. It's possible that Hornet simply lacks scars or other markings that an adult bug would acquire between molts, as she regularly heals herself by binding her shell with silk. This seeming of youth reinforces that there is ambiguity in universe surrounding Hornet's age. Another conversation that's illuminating in the enigma it presents is between Hornet and the mask maker. The mask maker does just that. He makes masks, which many bugs in the setting seem to wear. However, the line between masks and faces is blurry here. The mask maker's craft is to bestow faces, and so identities, on those who need them. Speaking to Hornet with his own mask removed, apparently rendering him lucid, he tells Hornet that her form is unresolved. Hornet says that she has accepted her own transitory state and doesn't plan on changing, but according to the mask maker, her kind rarely develop evenly, and she may have more growing left to do. Hornet's age is as ambiguous as Lace's, and this reinforces the idea that they are peers, both immortal entities of a semi-divine nature, both subject to an age of thankless service as protectors of their homes. If Lace can be interpreted as a child, then so can Hornet. Lace's structural role in Silksong is similar to Hornet's in Hollow Knight as well. After the demo appeared at E3 in 2019, Team Cherry said in a blog post that Lace represented a huge test of player skill, similar to the Knight's fight with Hornet in the original game. These structural parallels are even clearer in the full release. Much as Hornet tests the player's resolve in Hollow Knight, Hornet proves that she can withstand Farloom's hospitality against Lace in their first fight. Lace also stands in the way of a movement ability. Hornet guarded the knight's dash, and while Hornet requires a dash to reach Lace, Lace is blocking the far fields, where Hornet obtains the Drifter's Cloak, a gliding mechanic. And in the original game, the knight proves its resolve to assume the mantle of king in a second fight with Hornet, while in Silksong, Hornet overcomes Lace again to complete her ascent of Farloom as queen, or to reject her place as monarch in a bid for freedom that ultimately frees both her and Lace. The two protagonists' claims to royal status represent vastly different things, but to make them, the knight must overcome Hornet, Hallownest's sentinel, and Hornet must overcome Lace, Farloom's knight. It's in considering Hornet and Lace as protectors where we find some of their most compelling narrative parallels. Hornet guarded Hallownest through a period of stasis imposed by the seal on the Hollow Knight. Though she doesn't outright say it, it's possible to piece together the idea that Hornet chose to take on this responsibility based on some details from both games. In the Red Memory sequence in Silksong, we see Hera, Hornet's birth mother, impart to Hornet the importance of choosing her own path. Hera expresses how greater, grander aspirations, such as queendom, were neither Hornet's own nor what Hera wanted for her daughter. In the original game, the knight can find the Weaver's Den in Deep Nest. Using the dream nail on Weaver corpses reveals that the Weavers seem to have thought fondly of Hornet as their princess, and they left her the Weaver Song charm for protection and companionship. Since it appears that they thought so highly of her, it's likely that she chose specifically to stay behind in Hallownest, rather than go with them. There's no reason to think they would have left her behind otherwise. In a prequel comic released in association with the Hollow Knight Kickstarter, Hornet states that Hallownest will only grant death, as will she to those who seek to desecrate it. The claim she stakes over the kingdom's ruins sounds quite personal. Both she and her home will grant death. It certainly sounds like a responsibility she embraced, no matter how much pain or loss she had to endure as a result. Returning to Silksong, Hornet encounters the Second Sentinel, a robot bug charged with protecting the Citadel. Hornet awoke it from a state of dormancy, and encourages it to think about whether or not its charge of protecting a dying land is worth upholding. She outright tells it that some would consider such a task foolish. It appears that, while she was protecting Hallownest of her own will, she's developed some complicated feelings about her choice following the end of the infection. Specifically, her framing implies that she's trying to convince the Second Sentinel to choose differently than she did. Now, let's take a look at Lace with the idea of such self-imposed burdens in mind. The caretaker, at least, believes that Lace saw herself as the Citadel's protector, and Lace thought of herself as a knight, specifically her mother's knight. Lace served in this capacity through a long period of relative calm in the Citadel, which sounds similar to the period in Hallownest when the infection was less active before the knight arrived, and through which Hornet served. We don't know exactly what purpose Lace was created for, beyond Grandmother Silk feeling she needed a child to maintain her identity as a mother. Better any child than none. However, Lace pleads to her mother to see her as both a knight and simply as a daughter. When we see Lace, she pops up freely around Farloom, and she says that she's keeping a close eye on Hornet through the latter's travels. Lace seems to have the run of the kingdom, and from this it's possible to conclude that she did not have much of her mother's attention. This leads to both the jealousy we see Lace express toward Hornet, as the one Lace's mother wants, and, far before that, it likely drove Lace to act as the Citadel's protector on her mother's behalf. Both Hornet and Lace had to make cruel choices in their roles. Looking at their dialogue and their respective first encounters from both games, Hornet bluntly tells the knight that she knows what it is and what it would try to do. Though she seems hostile at first, it later becomes apparent that she was trying to spare it from the fate of replacing its sibling as the Hollow Knight. Lace, of course, is even more openly aggressive when Hornet first meets her. She threatens to kill Hornet with evident cruelty, but consider how she frames it. She says she wants to save Hornet. This is probably a genuine sentiment on Lace's part. It isn't personal. It's not that Lace cares about Hornet at first. But in Lace's own long life, she has known no other form of mercy, and we know that she has spent an age offering pilgrims such salvation. We also see at least one example of what happens to weavers or their descendants in the monarch's clutches in the form of Widow. Widow is a boss who considers herself one of Grandmother Silk's first children. She's fanatically devoted to her mother. We don't know exactly why Widow is so faithful, but given the weaver's rejection of Grandmother Silk, it seems likely that force was involved. Widow's silk has been bound to prevent her from using it by 2 large pins stuck through her back, and her mask, which again might have been closer to her face as humans would think of it, was forcibly removed. And this is just the treatment given to an ordinary weaver or one of their descendants. Given Hornet's unique nature and her strength, it's possible that there was an even worse fate planned for her. Perhaps Lace really believed that death would be a better option for her foe. In short, both Hornet and Lace took on the bitter responsibilities of knighthood voluntarily and for love. Both performed the task without reward, and both genuinely wished to shield others around them from harm. However, their abilities were limited in their contexts as protectors, such that death was often the kindest thing they could offer to those around them. Still, Hornet in the original Hollow Knight expresses gratitude for her existence, in spite of all the ills of her world, while Lace has grown resentful and believes her life to be hollow and false as a result of similar experiences. To understand how these different perspectives came to be, we can look at their mothers. To start with, Hornet has 3. Team Cherry originally envisioned Hornet as the child of 3 queens. They weren't able to fit the concept into Hollow Knight, but it seems to hold true based on Silksong's Red Memory sequence, where Hornet enters her own memories. Her stepmother, the White Lady, was the Queen of Hallownest. Vespa, the Queen of the Bee's Hive, instructed Hornet in combat and seems to have imparted some other lessons as well. Her birth mother, Hera the Beast, was the Queen of the Spider Kingdom of Deepnest, whose bugs resisted the Pale King's rule. But when his first plan to trap the Radiants failed, the king approached Hera, seeking her strength of will for his next attempt. Hera would sacrifice herself in eternal sleep to serve as a part of the seal on the Hollow Knight, and in exchange, the Pale King would have a child with her. In Silksong, it's confirmed that Hera was a weaver, likely one of those that fled Farloom to escape Grandmother Silk, and certainly one of those afflicted with the Weaver Curse of fertility issues. If you asked her, Hera probably would have said that she had no mother, or had never known her. Her mother was some small, skittering creature in the dark, who may or may not have been elevated with her. But Hera knew how Grandmother Silk treated her, and her fellow weavers. She remembered the burdens placed upon them as part of this supposed daughterhood. When she found a way to overcome the Weaver's curse in exchange for her life, Hera wanted her own daughter to live free of such struggles. In the Red Memory sequence, Hera's words to Hornet were that Hornet should resist the desires that others might impose upon her, and seek hope of her own. Her message stayed with Hornet long after Hornet had forgotten her mother's face. In the same sequence, we see that Vespa reinforced this message in her own way, encouraging Hornet to grow strong so that she could withstand those who would fear her or try to use her. The White Lady's appearance here, however, has a different character than those of Hera and Vespa, long-dead mortals. The White Lady is herself a god, and she is somehow able to speak with Hornet in real time through her memory. The White Lady acknowledges the pain Hornet must have borne to understand the wishes of Hallownest's rulers, and accepts who Hornet has become by offering her the Everbloom. Hornet was loved. For all that Hornet suffered, it was the love she received that drove her to take responsibility for her parents' fallen kingdoms. She was not only allowed, but encouraged to be her own person, even when that might put her in conflict with others around her. She was not only loved, but respected and loved unconditionally. Lace was less fortunate in this regard. She had only one mother, who stood over her not as a guide or mentor, but as an absolute authority. Unfortunately, this show of power through parenthood is one of the more realistic aspects of the game. Lace was originally created to her mother's specifications and never felt that her mother ever saw her for who she was. She was born to be a daughter and could never be anything more, to the extent that she feels false for having been her own person, when she was only supposed to secure the monarch's sense of identity as a mother. Still, she sought her mother's love through service as Grandmother Silk's knight. Hera condemned herself to eternal sleep to have a daughter of her own to cherish, however briefly. Lace exists as an eternal daughter because other supposed daughters condemned their would-be mother to eternal sleep. Lace and Hornet's lives reflect each other, born from and marked by suffering, long and lonely due to their strange natures, and both desperately wanted. However, Lace was never wanted for herself, and felt pressured to become the Citadel's protector to earn her mother's love. Hornet, meanwhile, was loved so fiercely that she spent much of her long life protecting something that was already lost to honor those who gave her that life. As characters in the same story, Lace and Hornet represent different perspectives on the same role, much as how a gem can be carved to catch the light on different facets. To say that motherhood is a theme in Hollow Knight's Silksong rather undersells the point. Childhood is as well, daughterhood specifically, and continuing from the first game, the question of what parents leave their children. Though much about Lace remains mysterious, one thing about her is clear. She is the true daughter of Grandmother Silk, the monarch's creation. The weavers rejected that position, but no matter how much Lace has suffered in it, she does not. Lace is the cruel and crude daughter of something holy, holy in spite of what it means that this higher being was capable of making something so wretched. In the words of Grandmother Silk, Lace was made to be pure, frail, and mad. She was spun with these traits in mind. A child made purely of the monarch's own silk, unlike the uplifted beasts. A frail child, who would need to rely on her mother to live. In the Hunter's Journal, Hornet observes that much silk would have been needed to see her sustained. A child born mad? Madness isn't normally a desirable trait. It may refer to a degree of religious fervor that Grandmother Silk wanted to instill. The divine monarch hoped to guarantee that her newest child would be devoted and indeed would wish for her mother's waking. Perhaps such a child would have been as devoted to her own daughterhood as the monarch was to motherhood. Perhaps, though Grandmother Silk should have known better, as we know that Lace was not her only attempt at spinning a child. Lace has a sibling. This detail is missable. The sibling in question, Phantom, is found in the exhaust organ, a place that is at once location and industrial machine. The exhaust organ is located in Bilewater, and its purpose is to remove waste from the Citadel. Phantom has apparently been condemned to be its caretaker, and they challenge Hornet when she passes through. They have no standard dialogue, but using the needolin, they will demand via operatic performance that Hornet free them from their fading fate. Hornet kills them, at which point they violently unravel. Their Hunter's Journal entry confirms they were a being strung from silk, before we learn that the same is true of Lace. We know that Lace and Phantom are siblings because of the needolin as well. In addition to prompting dialogue from NPCs and enemies, Hornet can play the needolin in certain locations to view memories in those places. In a tucked-away room in the exhaust organ, Hornet can play her song, and we see Lace's distinctive silhouette standing in front of a tank. Phantom floats within. The tank appears to be some kind of healing or life support system. It's unclear whose words or thoughts these are, but the memory's dialogue is, "Why us? Why us, sister? She spun us to break. She spun us to fade." Though spry enough to challenge Hornet in a duel to the death, further needolin dialogue in Phantom's boss fight suggests that their silk is stretched thin. It seems that their condition is deteriorating, and likely has been for some time. We don't know why they were abandoned by their mother or how they came to occupy the exhaust organ, But there's one thing they obviously represent: lace's possible future. If it takes much silk to sustain silk-spun beings such as Lace and Phantom, Phantom's physical condition probably results from their not having a reliable source of silk for sustenance, which their mother would probably have provided in the past. And so, through them, we have some idea of what would likely have happened to Lace if she stepped too far out of line. Even if her mother usually left her to her own devices, anything like active rebellion was a non-starter, or she risked being left to rot alive. Continuing to get speculative here, in spite of Lace's perception of herself as a childish husk, much of her suffering probably stems from her mother's emotional immaturity. Emotional maturity, essentially a person's ability to healthily manage their emotions, is a relatively contemporary concept, but Silksong is a contemporary work, so it's a perspective worth considering even if none of the characters would use the term. Mothers are meant to be nurturing and supportive to their children. They are meant to provide safety and comfort. That is the ideal of motherhood, often forced upon women whether they want it or not. Grandmother Silk, however, dearly wanted it. Whether it was a period of doting before she grew bored of her newest creation, sporadic bursts of affection, possibly following her lashing out, and meant to serve as an apology to her daughter, or if it took some other form, Lace likely knew love conditionally. And then she lost it, whether in one moment or 100 small ones. Lace would have known her mother's love as a fickle thing, indeed the same to her as a monarch's favor or a god's blessing. But of course, Lace wanted that love in turn. Even if she could not be a daughter worthy of love in her own eyes, she craved that love. And with only this one authority to define what love meant, unlike Hornet with her 3 mothers, Lace had no context to want anything else. Even considering Phantom, who Lace apparently knew, they were both spun from the monarch silk, and so both would have been working from that same model. We can only hope that they managed to carve out some peace for themselves, at least for a time, apart from their mother. What does that mean for the emotional maturity of those involved, Grandmother Silk and Lace in particular? We know that Grandmother Silk was resentful of the Weavers. We know that this justified betrayal and loss drove her to create at least 2 new children she hoped to control more completely. And we get one glimpse into her emotional state prior to Act 3. After Hornet frees the town of Bellheart from the haunting, she asks one of its residents what he experienced in the haunting's thrall. He describes being overwhelmed by strange, sad memories. Grandmother Silk has been wallowing in her slumber, and she has taken her sorrows out on the kingdom beneath her. That is the nature of the haunting. Lace, whatever her age, is almost certainly more emotionally mature than her mother, and was probably at times responsible for managing her mother's emotions when she had her mother's attention at all. Cheer her up, calm her down, whatever Lace had to do in the hope of earning love or simply protecting herself from her mother's wrath. I'm not saying that Lace is a model of good mental health in fiction, just that it's another cruel twist to their mother and daughter relationship, with the daughter forced to support the mother. This could only have been a suffocating experience. Lace had no meaningful stability in her unchanging world. She had only what her mother would give, silk and emotional scraps. She needed these, wanted them, deeply resented them, and loathed herself for these feelings. She reveled in suffering as her only form of control, and she would offer others the only mercy she knew, the only possible escape from Farloom's gilded cage. The death she could never have herself, sustained as she was by the monarch's silk. The monarch clung to her identity as a mother and shaped Lace to be nothing but a daughter. When Lace found that she could not fulfill this unreasonable expectation, she felt broken for it. She felt hollow. As Hornet observes in the first game, children do not choose the circumstances into which they are born. Parents do for their children. And yet a child cannot stay a child, no matter how a parent attempts to stifle them. People grow and change, and children are, from the beginning, people. This was as true in Hollow Knight as it is in Silksong. Just as the vessels, including the knight and the hollow knight, were never empty, Lace was never going to remain the child she was meant to be. For good or for ill, the idea of a person unable to grow is as much an impossibility as a truly hollow creature being able to dream. However, Lace was meant to be a child. When she fails at this, she rejects the notion of herself being alive in any real way. She literally calls the idea gross. Hornet tells Lace that she has seen others make the same mistake, the mistake of failing to acknowledge life and personhood where it should thrive. Hornet, though, saw other people making this mistake who were not the ones being mistaken. Lace is, frankly, wrong about herself. She has decided that she is hollow, that she is worthless, a flawed and ultimately irredeemable creation who longs for the love of her creator, a creator who styles herself intentionally as a mother, that supposed ultimate source of nurturing and indeed love. Lace failed as a daughter because she apparently cannot love nor be loved as a daughter should, and since Lace can only be a daughter, that means she is a failure entirely, or so she had come to believe. But she felt this way because of her mother, because Grandmother Silk was never prepared to love Lace as a person, but only as a daughter in relation to herself. Lace's mother held the power in their relationship, as parents do. Her mother, so holy in Lace's eyes even when she saw herself as cruel and crude. Her mother, unfathomable, untouchable, until Hornet instilled the idea that it could be otherwise. It is this idea that opens the way to Act 3. Hornet's persistence, Lace's rebellion, and the strength of both of their wills that granted a chance to break the cycle trapping them. When Lace confronted Hornet in the coral chambers, and Hornet bade Lace to keep watching, it seems that Lace listened, and what she saw gave her what she needed to risk striking against Farloom's god and monarch, her own mother. Of course, there must be more to it than that. The seed of Lace's resentment was planted long ago. By all rights, it should have been uprooted before it could flower, her own will broken by her mother's. Instead, at long last, she fights back. If Lace was as empty as she expresses herself to be, none of this would have bothered her. Her feelings would have been uncomplicated if she had any at all. She would really have been the joyfully violent creature she presented herself as, and she wouldn't have had any reason to rebel, whatever the size of that rebellion. And much as the Hollow Knight's sense of self allowed the Radiance to gain a foothold, so do Lace's feelings allow the Void to warp her in Act 3. Lace tried. She really did. It wasn't just about Hornet. Though I do think Lace had, in spite of herself, developed some admiration for the meddlesome spider. It was about revenge. It was about being seen, if only at the very end. It was about freeing herself, and possibly Farloom, from her mother's grasp at last. And she failed, badly. The moment when she finally dares to fight for herself, and it brings the kingdom to the point of collapse. More specifically, her mother brings the kingdom to the point of collapse for Lace's sake. Perhaps her mother saw her, or perhaps her mother simply refused to let go of an ideal of a daughter. Perhaps Grandmother Silk's feelings were somewhere in between these points, deciding that Lace was a worthy daughter after all, whether or not in the way that Lace would have wanted. But to Lace, it may have felt like she finally tried to find a way forward that was not the cold mercy of death, and so ruined everything. The nature of the Void is its own subject, but it is certainly connected to regret. And Lace seems like the kind of character to have many regrets, old and new. The Void also appears to have a reflective element. It gives what it gets. It is typically content to lie still and silent below the world, waiting for substance to reach it naturally. But when the world interferes, the consequences are grave. Below Hallownest, it was enraged by the Pale King's abuse. In Farloom, it takes hold of Grandmother Silk's grasping threads and quests upward, seeking life from below, much as she sought control from above. So it reflects Lace as well. It draws out her bitterness, exaggerates her resentment, and allows her to finally express these with honest abandon. She taunts Hornet more viciously than before, inviting Hornet to join her in her drowning palace. In doing so, she claims her and her mother's tomb as her own royal home, the inheritance she never expected to receive. She offers all of Farloom the mercy she once offered Hornet, ready to destroy it all to end the kingdom's cruelty, even as she seems bent on forcing the spider herself to walk away. Of course, Hornet refuses to back down. Throughout the final boss fight, as Lace is staggered, you see her coating of void falling away. And once Hornet wins, something interesting happens. Lace's unconscious body sinks beneath the void and emerges clean. Perhaps the void could have claimed her, but in that moment, it does not. The void gives what it gets. Something in Lace wants to live, has always wanted to live, and it isn't as though Hornet convinced her, at least not in the abyss. They fought without exchanging any words that we hear. No, it's something within Lace herself that allows her to rise again. And when they've broken the surface with the help of Hornet's siblings, Lace's laugh is hard to read, but it seems disbelieving, as though she can hardly accept what's happened. The dark did not take her. Farloom's gilded cage is broken. She has a chance to live free. Now, let's return to the beginning of the game, to the silk fly that freed Hornet from her cage. If Lace sent that silk fly, why? The most straightforward answer is, in defiance of her mother. Though Lace doesn't say it until the end, she wanted from the beginning to deny her mother Hornet's silken strength. She wanted her mother to see her instead, not another weaver, and especially not the weaver that might finally wake the monarch, when one of Lace's very reasons for being was to wish her mother's waking. She had no desire to be rendered further redundant. And beyond her jealousy, she may have been tired, worn down by her own sorrows, exhausted by her endless performance of daughterhood, and by the cruelty she saw and the cruelty she inflicted. So even before Hornet offers Lace another path, before Lace knows Hornet as anything more than a distant, trapped figure, Lace tries to change something. Lace frees Hornet. Within the narrative, Lace is probably why we have a game. Lace's role in Silksong can indeed be understood as a foil to Hornet. As Hornet is the daughter of Hallownest, once its lonely protector and ever the bearer of its memory, Lace is the daughter of Farloom, similarly isolated and just as willful, but led to see herself as less than a person when Hornet was allowed to live her own life, whatever she chose to do with it. This lets Hornet see both herself and her siblings in Lace, and the contrast between the two casts the whole of both characters in a clearer light. As a matter of interpretation, it is, of course, possible that Lace is a child, just as Hornet might be, and this would do nothing to lessen Lace's significance. However, the game's story is stronger with the understanding that they are both grown. Neither are children, and though both are referred to as such, it usually has more to do with their parentage than their age. Hollow Knight was, in large part, about being able to choose your own purpose instead of staying confined by one that was forced on you, and learning that you can choose something new even if you can no longer fulfill what you'd believed your purpose to be. Silksong again explores this idea and expands on it. For Hornet, she can become the queen she was meant to be, but if she rejects this role, the world itself changes dramatically as a result, and the story reaches its more hopeful conclusion. For Lace, she has spent her existence constrained by a role that no longer fits her. She chafes against it, while believing as a result of this very discomfort that she cannot be a person in any real sense. Hornet, who has borne a similar burden but reached a very different conclusion, sees the way Lace has indeed mistaken herself. And though Hornet doesn't quite manage to convince Lace of her personhood, she does bring Lace out of the darkness into a world where she can learn who she is for herself. Lace can be honest about the fact that her purpose does not suit her anymore, and claim an identity beyond being the eternal daughter of the monarch. Silksong, like Hollow Knight before it, has a cast full of charming and engaging characters. and some of them even get to live this time. While they all have a role that strengthens the story, there are probably some that you could remove without radically changing the fundamental shape of the game. Lace is not one of those characters. She resides at the heart of Silksong's narrative, right alongside Hornet herself.